International Relations and Security at Loughborough University. Afzal, thank you so much indeed for your time. You know, just going through that list, it becomes completely clear. I mean, you don't even have to be an expert in Iraqi politics to understand the issues that could arise. Let me take you back to Saddam Hussein's era. Did these problems exist then, and that they were only suppressed because the country had a dictator in charge?
Well, I think to some degree, of course, the problems existed. The two major problems that you've identified that are actually dominating this election and have actually dominated politics for the last 10 or more years, 15 years. Those two problems are the lack of unity within the country, the fragmentation of the country along ethnic and nationalistic lines with the Kurds and the Shias and the sort of Sunni minorities. And then you've got the second problem of ineffective and inefficient governance, corrupt governance. Now, the lack of unity was to some degree masked by Saddam Hussein. He suppressed the PUK and the KDP, which were fairly violent organizations looking for autonomy, and he was able to sort of keep that through oppression under the lid. But what Saddam Hussein did do was provide a very effective system of governance and services. Iraq stood out in the region as one of the most advanced countries in terms of logistics, in terms of health, in terms of education and so on. And apart from his psychotic sons, generally the rule of law stood, and people had very much higher standards of living. Now, what happened when in 2005, when the Americans instituted so-called democratic elections, the problem there with timescales was that democracy wasn't allowed to evolve, and it had the opposite effect. It fragmented the country along identity lines that I've discussed, but it also empowered the activist organization, what was known as the Skiri Party, which was a militant Islamist Shia party with connections with Iran. And so what we've had subsequently is these militant parties in power using violent means sometimes to maintain power, with assassinations and so on, using patronage, leading to high levels of corruption. Now, the Sadristas you've suggested, Muqtada al-Sadr, is, of course, gaining a great deal of ground, but of course he represents a particular faction, and he will not have any significant influence in the Kurdish regions, although he might have some influence over the Sunni areas. He certainly has some tacit support from Ayatollah Sistani, who is effectively the religious head of the Shias in Iraq, and both of them have been calling for social reform, highlighting the importance of basic services and so on. And I think if he does dominate the next elections and the government, there will be an attempt to improve social services, but I think his efforts will probably not deliver what the Iraqi people deserve.
Afzal, do you mind? We're going to run out of time, and I really want to ask you a follow-up question. If you don't mind, just a brief answer. I mean, you're talking about social services, social reforms. Is that going to be driving people in their choice of who they vote for? Because in previous years, presumably, it may well have been security. Literally just staying alive in Iraq with all the attacks were happening could have been people's priority. Has that changed?
Well, I think, yes, that's definitely changed. People were demonstrating in 2019, particularly for social reform, for services and so on. Unfortunately, however, my worry is, and I think a lot of commentators are saying the same thing, that these people who wanted social reform have given up. They can't see it being delivered. There isn't a moderate and uniting force in Iraqi politics. So I think the big problem is that people are beginning to give up because they haven't seen the fruits of their activism, the moderates.
Always appreciate it, Afzal. Thank you so much indeed. Afzal Ashraf speaking to us from London.